January 17, 1943, 27,000 feet above the frozen fields of Wilhelmshaven. The air is thin enough to kill, cold enough to turn sweat into ice crystals inside a leather flight jacket. Lieutenant Friedrich Lang tightens his grip on the control column of his Messerschmitt Bf-109G6, scanning the pale winter sky through a canopy fogged at the edges by his own breath. Below, the patchwork of German farmland stretches away into the haze. Above, contrails streak the stratosphere like chalk lines drawn by an invisible hand. His radio crackles with the staccato German of the ground controller. Achtung, Achtung, schwere Bonga-Formation, bearing 270, Angels 25, approximately 40 bongas. Lang feels his pulse quicken. 40 B-17’s, flying fortresses. He has heard the name whispered in the ready rooms at Ever Airfield, spoken with a mixture of contempt and caution by the older pilots who flew against the RAF over Britain. The Americans are new to this sky. Their formations are still experimental, their tenors barely trained. The Luftwaffe command has circulated intelligence reports describing the American heavy bombers as lumbering, underarmed, vulnerable. Lang has read these reports. He has believed them, the way young men believe in their own invincibility. But now, as he pulls back on the stick and climbs toward the contrails, he feels something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Not fear, not yet. Anticipation, perhaps, the kind a hunter feels when approaching game that might be larger than expected. He breaks through a layer of cirrus cloud and sees them, a formation so tight it looks like a single mechanical organism. 43 B-17 flying fortresses, arranged in staggered combat boxes, their aluminum skins catching the winter sunlight, glowing like a constellation of distant suns. Each bomber is massive, 65 feet from nose to tail, a wingspan wider than most buildings are tall. They do not weave or evade. They do not break formation. They simply fly, steady and inexorable, as if the sky itself has granted them safe passage. Lang banks his fighter into position, throttling up to attack speed. Around him, a dozen other 109s converge from different altitudes, their engines screaming. Standard doctrine, attack from head-on, where the bombers are most vulnerable, where a single burst can shatter the cockpit and send the entire machine into a death spiral. Lang selects his target, a B-17 in the lead element, slightly higher than the others. He angles toward it, the distance closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. At 1,000 meters, he can see the bomber's nose turrets swivel toward him. At 800 meters, he sees the first muzzle flashes. And then the sky opens up. Tracers, brilliant, incandescent lines of orange and white, erupt from the nose turret, from the top turret, from the waist guns on either side of the fuselage. Not one gun, not two, a storm of gunfire, interlocking fields of fire that seem to reach out across the sky like the fingers of some mechanical god. Lang's fighter shudders as rounds crack past his wings. He fires his own cannon, a 2-second burst, sees his shells arc toward the bomber's cockpit, and then he is through, rolling violently to avoid a collision, diving away as more tracers chase him down. His wingman is not so lucky. Lang catches a glimpse of the other Messerschmitt disintegrating in midair, one wing shearing off in a spray of aluminum and flame. The pilot never has time to scream. Lang pulls out of the dive at 12,000 feet, breathing hard, his hands shaking on the controls. Above him, the formation of B-17s continues eastward, untouched, unbroken. He looks at his fuel gauge. Enough for one more pass, maybe two. He looks at the sky, at the remaining fighters circling like wolves around a herd of armored elephants. And for the first time in his career as a fighter pilot, Friedrich Lang understands that he is not the hunter. He is the hunted. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was never supposed to be a defensive masterpiece. When the United States Army Air Corps first issued specifications for a long-range heavy bomber in 1934, the primary concern was payload and range. How much explosive weight could be delivered to enemy industrial targets, and how far into hostile territory could it penetrate without fighter escort. The notion of defensive armament was almost an afterthought, a concession to the reality that bombers, no matter how fast or high they flew, would eventually encounter enemy interceptors. 30 caliber guns scattered across nose, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions. The crews called them pea shooters, and they were not wrong. Against the cannon-armed fighters of Nazi Germany, these early defensive arrays were laughably inadequate. But war is a crucible, and the crucible refines. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Boeing and the Army Air Forces had learned bitter lessons from the European theater. RAF Bomber Command had bled heavily over Germany, losing Wellington and Sterling bombers by the dozens to determined Luftwaffe fighter attacks. The solution, American strategists concluded, was not faster bombers or heavier armor. It was guns, more guns, bigger guns, guns arranged in overlapping fields of fire so dense that no fighter could approach without running a gauntlet of lead. 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, nose, tail, dorsal, ventral ball turret, and twin waist positions. The B-17F added a 10th gun, 50 caliber machine guns, including a formidable chin turret beneath the nose, designed specifically to counter head-on attacks. Each gun could fire up to 850 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly 2 ounces and could punch through aluminum, steel, and human flesh with equal indifference at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. To the Luftwaffe pilots who first encountered these bristling machines in the skies over occupied Europe, the transformation was shocking. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille, who had earned legendary status fighting in North Africa, once remarked to a fellow pilot, "The British bombers are like slow elephants. You approach, you shoot, you leave. But these American fortresses, they are like elephants covered in spears." Marseille would not live to see the full evolution of the B-17's defenses. He died in a flying accident in September 1942. But his metaphor endured in the Luftwaffe consciousness. The B-17 was not merely defended, it was a flying porcupine, a mobile fortress that turned the act of attacking it into a calculated risk of death. The statistics bear out this transformation. In the early raids of 1942, when American heavy bombers first ventured over France and the Low Countries, Luftwaffe fighters achieved kill ratios of approximately 3 bombers destroyed for every fighter lost, a sustainable rate of attrition for the Germans, a catastrophic one for the Americans. But by mid-1943, as B-17Gs with upgraded armament entered combat and American gunners gained experience, the ratio began to shift. Data compiled from 8th Air Force after-action reports shows that by the autumn of 1943, Luftwaffe fighters were losing nearly 1 aircraft for every bomber they shot down. By early 1944, the ratio had reversed entirely. The cost of attacking a B-17 formation had become prohibitively high. Luftwaffe pilots began to speak openly of Festungsangst, fortress fear, a term that appeared in captured diaries and interrogation reports, describing the psychological toll of repeatedly facing the American bombers' massed defensive fire. Friedrich Lang returns to Jever Airfield with half his squadron missing.
He climbs out of the cockpit on legs that feel detached from his body, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold. 50 caliber rounds that came closer to killing him than he wants to admit. In the debriefing room, the squadron commander listens to the pilot's reports with a face carved from stone. 5 fighters lost, 2 pilots dead, 1 captured, 2 missing. The American formation dropped its bombs on the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven and flew home. Not a single B-17 was confirmed destroyed. The squadron commander lights a cigarette and stares at the map on the wall, where red pins mark the track of the American bombers. He does not speak for a long time. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he says, "They do not fly like bombers." It is an apt comparison. The B-17's defensive philosophy was not merely about firepower. It was about integration, overlapping coverage, mutual support. Each bomber in a combat box formation was positioned to cover the blind spots of its neighbors. The tail gunner of one aircraft watched the belly of the plane ahead. The dorsal turret gunner covered the high rear quarter, while the ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the fuselage in a rotating perspex sphere, protected the vulnerable underside. The waist gunners on either side of the fuselage provided flanking fire, their guns angled outward to catch fighters sweeping in from the beam. 50 caliber guns, later replaced by the twin-gun chin turret, to repel the most dangerous attacks of all, the head-on pass. This system was not theoretical. It was tested, refined, and proven in the blood-soaked skies over Germany. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. The mission, designated Black Thursday, would become one of the most costly air battles in history. 291 B-17’s set out from England. 60 did not return. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair.
But the German defenders paid a price too. Luftwaffe records indicate that over 38 fighters were destroyed that day, with dozens more damaged. Post-war analysis of German pilot casualty reports shows that at least 40 experienced fighter pilots were killed or wounded in the Schweinfurt battles, a loss rate the Luftwaffe could not sustain. The B-17’s had not achieved invulnerability, but they had achieved something almost as valuable. They had made the cost of victory unbearable for the enemy.
Veterans of the air war described it as the sound of hell's own factory, a cacophony of noise and violence that drowned out even the roar of the bomber's 4 Wright Cyclone engines. For the gunners inside the B-17, the noise was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it meant they were under attack, that fighters were close enough to kill them. Comforting because it meant they could fight back, that they were not helpless. The training required to operate these guns effectively was intense. Gunnery schools across the United States ran round-the-clock courses, teaching young men, most of them barely out of high school, how to track a moving target, how to lead a fighter traveling at 300 miles per hour, how to calculate deflection angles in the split seconds between sighting and firing. The instructors used every method available: clay pigeon ranges adapted for aerial gunnery, camera guns that recorded each trainee's aim, and eventually live fire exercises from the waist and turret positions of actual bombers. The washout rate was high. Not everyone had the combination of hand-eye coordination, spatial awareness, and raw nerve required to hit a target moving in 3 dimensions, while the aircraft beneath them bucked and shuddered through flak and turbulence. But those who graduated and made it to combat learned quickly that training was only the beginning. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Franklin Drew, a ball turret gunner with the 384th Bomb Group, described his first mission over Germany in his post-war account. "I thought I knew what to expect. I thought the training had prepared me. But when the first fighter came in, a Focke-Wulf 190, black crosses on the wings, and I swung the turret to track him, everything I had learned evaporated. My hands were shaking. My throat was dry. I pressed the triggers and the guns roared, and I had no idea if I was hitting anything. The fighter flashed past, so close I could see the pilot's face."
And then another came, and another, and I stopped thinking. I just fired. You don't aim, you point. Drew survived his tour of duty, 25 missions, the required number for rotation back to the States. He was credited with 2 confirmed kills and 3 probables, marks painted on the side of his bomber beneath the cockpit. But in his account, he never celebrated those kills. He wrote instead about the weight of the ammunition cans, the smell of spent gunpowder that clung to his clothes for days after each mission, the way his hands would cramp from gripping the gun handles for hours at a time. And he wrote about the fighters, the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that kept coming, mission after mission, despite the losses, despite the odds. They were brave men, Drew wrote. Braver than us, maybe. The Luftwaffe's tactical evolution in response to the B-17's firepower was a story of desperation and innovation. In the early months of 1943, as American daylight bombing rates intensified, German fighter commanders experimented with every conceivable method of attack. Head-on passes, once considered suicidal, became the preferred tactic because they offered the shortest exposure time to the bomber's defensive guns, a matter of seconds before the fighter flashed past and was gone. Pilots like Egon Mayer and Georg Peter Eder perfected the Sturmgruppe technique, forming waves of heavily armed and armored Focke-Wulf 190s that attacked in line abreast formations, concentrating their fire on a single bomber until it exploded or fell out of formation. The FW-190s were equipped with additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine, and some carried underwing rockets, Werfer-Granate 21 mortars that could be fired from outside the range of the bomber's guns, detonating in the midst of the formation and relying on shrapnel to damage multiple aircraft. These tactics worked, sometimes.
On February 20, 1944, during a raid on Leipzig, Sturmgruppen succeeded in downing 21 B-17’s in a single engagement, a devastating blow. But the cost was equally severe. 19 German fighters were destroyed, and over a dozen experienced pilots were killed. The calculus was brutal. The Luftwaffe could not replace its losses as quickly as the Americans could. Every pilot killed was a veteran who had survived years of combat, whose experience and skill could not be replicated in the training schools. Every fighter destroyed was a machine built by an industrial base already straining under Allied bombing. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of men and materiel. If 10 B-17’s were shot down over Germany, 20 more would take their place the next week. If 50 gunners were killed, 100 more would graduate from gunnery school and fly across the Atlantic to join the fight. General Major Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, understood this imbalance with cold clarity. In a post-war interview, Galland reflected, "We could win battles. We could shoot down 50 bombers in a day and call it a victory. But the Americans could afford to lose 50 bombers. They had 500 more. We could not afford to lose 30 fighters. We did not have 300 more." It was mathematics. The desperation manifested in increasingly extreme measures. In late 1943, the Luftwaffe began testing unconventional weapons designed to attack bomber formations from beyond the range of defensive fire. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor capable of climbing to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, was deployed in limited numbers in 1944. The Comet's speed, over 600 miles per hour, allowed it to slash through bomber formations before the gunners could react. But its endurance was measured in minutes, and its volatile rocket fuel made it as dangerous to its pilot as to the enemy.
Similarly, the May 262 jet fighter, introduced in the final year of the war, possessed speed and firepower that made it nearly invincible in combat. But there were never enough of them, and by the time they arrived in meaningful numbers, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel, the pilots, and the infrastructure to employ them effectively. But even these technological marvels could not overcome the fundamental problem. The B-17's defensive firepower, multiplied across dozens or hundreds of bombers flying in mutually supporting formations, created a killing zone that no amount of speed or armor could fully negate. Luftwaffe pilots developed dark humor to cope with the reality. They called the B-17 formations polks, herds, and spoke of attacking them the way medieval infantry spoke of assaulting a castle. You might break through, you might kill the defenders, but you would leave blood on the walls. April 24, 1944, 30,000 feet above Munich. Friedrich Lang is still flying, still fighting, though he no longer recognizes the war he is in. His squadron has been rebuilt 3 times. Most of the pilots are new, boys barely out of training, their faces smooth and eager in a way that makes him feel ancient at 24. The veterans, those few who remain, do not speak much anymore. They smoke their cigarettes and check their guns and wait for the order to scramble. When the order comes, they climb into their cockpits with the resignation of men walking to the gallows. Today's raid is massive. Over 800 American bombers, B-17's and B-24 Liberators, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters that can now accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe's numerical advantage has evaporated. The skies over Germany belong to the Americans now. Lang knows this, every pilot knows this, but they take off anyway, because the alternative is surrender, and surrender is unthinkable.
Lang climbs through broken clouds and sees the bombers stretched across the horizon, formation after formation, glinting in the spring sunlight. The sight no longer fills him with anticipation. It fills him with exhaustion. He selects a target, a straggler, a B-17 trailing smoke from one engine, already wounded. Easier prey. He lines up for a beam attack, coming in from the side, hoping to exploit a gap in the defensive fire. At 500 meters, the bomber's waist guns open up. Lang sees the tracers arcing toward him, impossibly bright, impossibly fast. He fires a burst from his cannon, sees his shells strike the bomber's wing, and then he is past, rolling away, his fighter shuddering from impacts he does not remember hearing. He pulls up, scanning for threats. A P-51 Mustang drops out of the sun, guns blazing. Lang does not have time to evade. Cannon shells rip through his Messerschmitt's fuselage, shredding metal and severing control cables. The stick goes dead in his hands. The engine coughs and dies. Lang pulls the canopy release, unstraps, and throws himself into the void. The parachute deploys with a jerk that drives the breath from his lungs. Below, his fighter spirals earthward, trailing black smoke. Above, the formations of B-17's continue eastward, unbroken, untouched. Lang watches them until they disappear into the distance, and then he looks down at the ground rising to meet him, and he thinks, this is how it ends. Not with glory, with inevitability. The B-17's defensive firepower was more than a tactical advantage. It was a psychological weapon, a declaration of industrial and philosophical supremacy. A .50 caliber round fired from a B-17 was a product of American factories that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing munitions at a rate that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could achieve.
The Browning M2 machine gun itself was a marvel of mass production. Over 2 million were manufactured during the war, equipping everything from bombers to jeeps to landing craft. The ammunition, billions of rounds, rolled off assembly lines in quantities so vast that they seemed almost abstract, numbers too large to comprehend. To the men who flew against the B-17's, this abundance was both incomprehensible and terrifying. Luftwaffe pilots who survived being shot down and captured often expressed disbelief at the scale of American logistics. One captured pilot, interrogated at a British facility in 1944, remarked, "We were told that America was weak, that they cared only for money and comfort, that they would never endure a long war. But when I saw the bombers, hundreds of them, all new, all perfectly maintained, I knew we had been lied to. A nation that can build so many machines, that can waste so much ammunition, is not weak. It is something else." That something else was the American industrial machine operating at full capacity, driven by a combination of capitalist competition, government coordination, and a workforce that included millions of women who had entered factories for the first time. The B-17 itself was produced at a rate of approximately 14 aircraft per day at peak production, a new bomber rolling off the assembly line every 100 minutes. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, Douglas Aircraft's facility in Long Beach, and the massive Vega factory in Burbank together produced over 12,000 B-17's during the war. Each one required over 40,000 individual parts, hundreds of thousands of rivets, miles of wiring, and the labor of thousands of workers. The fact that this could be done at all, let alone on such a scale, was a testament to a form of power that transcended military might.
It was the power of a society organized around production, around efficiency, around the belief that any problem could be solved with enough resources and ingenuity. .50 caliber round became a symbol of this philosophy. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was brute force, applied with industrial precision. When a B-17 gunner pressed his triggers and sent a stream of half-inch diameter bullets hurtling across the sky at 2,000 feet per second, he was not merely defending his aircraft. He was wielding the accumulated might of a continent, the output of steel mills and powder plants and assembly lines that stretched from Detroit to Los Angeles. The Luftwaffe pilots who faced this firepower understood on some visceral level that they were not fighting individual crews or even individual bombers. They were fighting an idea, the idea that freedom and democracy, backed by industrial power, could not be defeated by ideology alone. The ball turret gunner's position was perhaps the most psychologically demanding role on a B-17. Suspended beneath the bomber's fuselage in a rotating perspex sphere, barely 4 feet in diameter, the ball turret gunner had no room to wear a parachute. If the aircraft was critically damaged, if the landing gear failed, if the turret jammed in the down position, the gunner was trapped. He would die in the crash, crushed between the belly of the bomber and the ground. Every man who volunteered for the position knew this. They climbed into the turret anyway, because someone had to, because the underside of the bomber was a blind spot that enemy fighters would exploit without mercy. The view from the ball turret was both spectacular and nightmarish. The gunner could see everything, the earth far below, the sky above, the bombers in formation around him, the fighters diving and weaving through the flak. He could see the tracer rounds from his own guns arcing outward, see the fighters explode or peel away trailing smoke.
And he could see his own mortality written in the proximity of the enemy, in the flak bursts that blossomed black and red against the sky, in the bombers that suddenly fell out of formation, trailing fire, disintegrating as they tumbled toward the earth. Sergeant William Bill O'Brien, who flew 28 missions as a ball turret gunner, described it in an interview decades later. "You were alone down there. I mean, the rest of the crew was above you, inside the plane, but you were in your own little world, a world made of glass and guns. If a fighter came at you from below, you were the only one who could stop him. And if you didn't, if you missed, then everyone died. That weight never left you, not during the mission, not after you landed." 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, electrically operated and synchronized to the gunner's hand controls. The gunner sat in a crouch, his knees drawn up, his feet resting on stirrups, his hands gripping the control handles that aimed the guns and fired them with thumb triggers. The turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from directly below the aircraft to just past horizontal. In theory, this gave the gunner a complete field of fire across the lower hemisphere. In practice, the turret was cramped, cold, and prone to mechanical failure. The perspex sphere fogged with the gunner's breath, the oxygen mask chafed, the intercom crackled with static and voices, sometimes clear, sometimes garbled, and the cold, the bone-deep, unrelenting cold of high altitude, seeped through every layer of heated suit and sheepskin, turning fingers numb and limbs sluggish. Yet the ball turret gunners were credited with hundreds of confirmed kills during the war. Their position, vulnerable as it seemed, gave them a unique vantage point for engaging fighters that attacked from below, a tactic favored by some Luftwaffe pilots who believed the B-17's belly was less defended. Those pilots learned otherwise.
The ball turret was not a weakness, it was a statement. There is no safe angle of attack. We are defended everywhere. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe had become a rout. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with as little as 20 hours of flight training, barely enough to take off and land, let alone engage in combat. The veterans, those few who remained, were exhausted, cynical, and increasingly certain that the war was lost. Allied air superiority was absolute. 1,000 bomber raids struck German cities and industrial targets with impunity, escorted by fighters that shot down any German aircraft foolish enough to challenge them. The B-17, once the symbol of American ambition and industrial might, had become a symbol of inevitability. Its engines droned over Germany day after day, and there was nothing that Germans could do to stop it.
Friedrich Lang surrendered to American forces in May 1945, along with what remained of his unit. He spent 2 years in a POW camp, was repatriated to Germany in 1947, and returned to a country that no longer existed, at least not in the form he remembered. In the decades that followed, he worked as a civil engineer, rebuilt a life, raised a family. He did not speak often about the war, but in a letter written to an American aviation historian in 1983, he reflected on his experience fighting the B-17s. I think now that we were not really fighting machines. We were fighting the idea behind the machines. The idea that a nation could build so much, so fast, and that this building was itself a form of warfare. We had courage, we had skill, but we did not have factories that could turn out bombers like toys. We did not have ammunition that fell from the sky like rain. And so we lost, not because we were cowards,
but because the other side had decided that nothing, no cost, no sacrifice was too much. That is the lesson I learned in the sky above Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress was retired from active service in the years following World War II. Jet-powered bombers like the B-47 and B-52 replaced it, aircraft capable of flying faster, higher, and farther. But the B-17's legacy endured. It endured in the veterans who flew and maintained it, in the museums where surviving airframes are preserved, in the air shows where a handful of restored fortresses still take to the sky, their engines roaring with the same deep-throated thunder that once filled the skies over Europe. And it endured in the lesson it taught, that defensive firepower, properly integrated and employed, could turn a vulnerable bomber into a weapon system so formidable that attacking it became an act of desperation. 50 caliber machine guns of the B-17G were not merely defensive weapons. They were instruments of doctrine, symbols of a philosophy that valued the lives of the crews enough to arm them so heavily that the enemy paid in blood for every attack. They were products of an industrial base so vast that it could afford to equip thousands of aircraft with millions of rounds of ammunition, and then do it again the next day and the day after that, until the enemy simply ran out of pilots and planes and will. They were proof that technology, when married to purpose and backed by resources, can shift the balance of power in ways that courage and skill alone cannot overcome. When Friedrich Lang watched the B-17 formations disappear into the distance on that April day in 1944, he was watching more than bombers. He was watching the future, a future in which wars would be won not by individual heroism, but by the collective output of entire nations. A future in which the difference between victory and defeat would be measured not in bravery, but in production capacity.
50 caliber machine guns, firing in unison from a single aircraft, would be the sound of inevitability itself. The B-17 taught the Luftwaffe and the world a truth that cannot be unlearned, that freedom, when defended with enough firepower, is a fortress no enemy can breach. Not because the fortress is impregnable, but because the cost of breaching it becomes too high to bear. The spears on the elephant's back are not meant to make the elephant invincible. They are meant to make the hunter think twice, to hesitate, to count the cost. And in that hesitation, in that calculation, the elephant walks on, unbroken, untamed, and free. That was the lesson of the B-17's defensive firepower. Not invulnerability, but the price of aggression. Not safety, but the promise that no enemy would ever find an easy target. The young men who flew in those bombers, who sat in cramped turrets and freezing ball positions, who pressed triggers and watched tracer rounds streak across the sky, were not invincible. Many of them died. But they made the enemy pay for every loss. And in the end, the enemy could no longer afford the bill. That is the truest form of defense, not the absence of vulnerability, but the presence of consequences so severe that the enemy looks for an easier fight and finds none. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a machine of war, but it was also a machine of belief, a belief that no tyranny, no matter how determined, could outlast the combined will and industry of free people who refused to be conquered.
50 caliber rounds it fired by the millions was unstoppable.